DMDongo here with another review from the DM's Guild. This time we're looking at Magnum Opus. Magnum Opus by Luke Monroe is a third-level adventure for 4 to 6 players. The adventure itself is kind of interesting. It has musical elements that bridge it throughout the entire adventure. Ways of kind of bringing those things in. And I like music in general in terms of bringing that into D&D. It's nice to have because it gives... music is one of those things that really can increase your immersion in something. Sound and music are really this good part of it. And the whole thing is built around this last manuscript of this very famous bard. And you get this, and at each page of the manuscript, or each chapter, contains some clue about the things the players will experience. And I'm not going to spoil too much here so that players and DMs can experience the kind of joy you get out of everything here. Now, what it isn't, however, is something that is fully realized, I guess is the right way of putting it. There isn't any battle maps, there isn't any of that stuff that would make it easy for the virtual tabletop crowd to include, but it is designed to be done all theater of the mind, with no need to ever kind of pull out miniatures or anything like that. You can do so with this, but it's not 100% necessary. It also includes 5 new monsters and 2 brand new magical items. And some really interesting... The monsters themselves are really interesting in the way they behave and what they do. Now, some are slight reskins of other monsters. There's an elk in there that is basically a reskin of a different elk. And there is a worm, a sandworm, that is very reminiscent of a purple worm with some interesting, unique traits to it that make it a little different. Now, what did I like about Magnum Opus? Well, I really like the idea behind it. The main crux of the adventure felt really original. It felt really well realized. The whole concept of getting this bard's final diary, as it were, and having those things be hints of it really inspired. I really love that. Now, I would have loved to see the actual journal as a handout and given to players. That's something that would be really impressive, and then you can kind of explain how it works. I also like that he gives a way of getting the hints themselves so that you can provide them to players. Say the player looks at a certain page and goes, oh, well, I don't understand what that means in this context. But you can go, well, as part of that, here is you can make a this or that check, and you can attempt to give them part of the hint so they can go, oh, I understand what that does. That's like a really strange dance that has an incredibly long, unrhythmic pattern. That might make sense. It's like, okay, well, what does that mean in the context I'm in? They don't necessarily know, but they can kind of work it out. They might be able to work it out from there once things start occurring. The other thing I really liked is that the magical items that are present are really interesting. They're really different. There's a magical item that you can get that evolves as your player evolves. It means you only have to provide it once, and then you can see it there. You can it just grows with it. Now, I've seen this concept done in 3.5. Yes, I think there was the legendary items that would grow as your character would grow, and they were kind of an interesting idea around evolving items and how a player would have one item and they would go on quest to make it stronger and more powerful. I think it was like in the epic level handbook, if I'm correct. I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I've played that edition of D&D. But part of those items was really interesting, and I like to see that in this supplement. It's nice to see that, and it's nice to see other things like it. The other item, I'm not going to spoil what it is, but I really like it thematically. It fits really nicely with this. It fits the villain itself, who's at the end of this, fits really well, and it has a lot of really good plot hooks to branch off from here based on what happens in the adventure. Now, what didn't I like about the adventure? Well, like I said, there aren't any battle maps, so for me, who exclusively plays a virtual tabletop, doing pure theater of the mind can be problematic. not because necessarily that people can't do it over the internet, but because you have the internet right in front of you, it kind of leads to cases of distraction happening for players. So you need something to kind of grip them and keep their focus as much as possible. And maps and handouts and all of this stuff kind of help with that, speeding up combat as much as possible, trying to leverage the fact that I've got an access to APIs that can control things that I wouldn't be able to control in real life, that I don't need to worry about when we're all talking and sitting around a table. And so that's something you need to consider here. If you're running a virtual tabletop, there's going to be a lot more work involved to get this working for your table. If your virtual tabletop group is perfectly capable of doing theater of the mind style adventures with minimal distraction and everyone maintaining focus, great. Another thing I didn't like, or I thought could be improved, is I really would have loved to see the physical handout for the Magnum Opus. I would have loved to see that physical thing as kind of a really nice thing to give a player. Not something where you're necessarily like a really high quality, just like a dusty tome style background with like the image of some very complicated dance and maybe a small text explanation of what it is. And then similar for all the other ones. It would have been really nice to see that, because it's just one of those things that you can hand players and then they can just go and run with it. It also wasn't exactly clear from the start how the players get started. How do they go from having this Magnum Opus to, well, I've got it, now what do I do with it? Now, that's a lot of work for the DM to kind of bridge that gap. Now, it says in the description how you DM fill in the space here, but it would have been nice to have an example or some kind of idea of how that works, how you bridge that gap. Finally, on to my rating. What do I think about Magnum Opus as a whole? Well, I'm going to be using my perk system because it's an adventure module and that's the easiest way to do it. So I'm going to start with combat. So combat in this is really interesting. There's a lot of really interesting combat encounters that can potentially occur. The final battle I really like because the enemy in it is very charismatic, it's very interesting, it's very unique, and it's very kind of iconic in a weird pop culture kind of way. I don't want to spoil him, but he is so interesting. The way he is done gives a good indication of how he would be played, but the thing is, your players might not even fight them. In fact, that's the whole thing with this entire adventure. There is a very real possibility that you won't fight anything, that you can roleplay your way or think your way out of any combat encounter. There's no mandatory combat here, which is kind of nice to see. But for combat, like in terms of how they play out, I really like it. It's really well done. Now, there isn't things like environmental factors which really make the combat more interesting and more varied. It just exists as a combat encounter. Yes, there are some things where things can come up from the ground, but it would have been nice to have things like cover or environmental things that can occur or happen, like you can control various bits and pieces, or unique and interesting abilities beyond the final boss that mean that or the final villain that mean that you can do some really interesting and cool things or exploit things, something that leverages ability for players to think strategically, so it challenges them. But the combat is really nice, serviceable. I would say I'd give combat a 3, just because of the amount of combat you can avoid. This adventure is not for groups that really love combat. Right. Next on to roleplay. Roleplay here, though, this is where this adventure really shines. If your players can think, if your players can talk, if your players can manage the way that things go, there's ample opportunity to roleplay within the adventure. Not just, there's like less bits, because you can have instances where it's just a case of the players working out what is this thing asking us to do, how do I do it? But then you move on from there, and there are at least 4 other NPCs that the players can interact with, and maybe through some clever interactions they can get them on side, switch the encounter, or get something different. So for roleplay, I'm going to give it a 5. I really love what's presented here. It's really interesting in the way it's done. Next, on to exploration. Well, unfortunately, the exploration pillar in this doesn't really get leveraged very much. There is only one path through. There's not much to explore and to look at and to kind of branch out and come back and find out about this kind of world. You only really get the very hint of the tease of exploration in terms of, well, you're presented with a room, here's the thing in the room. You're presented with another room, here's the thing in the room. It doesn't leverage that exploration really well until the end, when the players can be presented sort of with a choice. And that's kind of part of the exploration tab, is to explore choices and decisions. That last one gives a really good way of doing things, because it also it gives you a good plot hook. Now, the plot hook it gives is slightly heavy-handed, but the players are always aware of what that decision is and kind of what is gonna happen if they make that decision, or what is potentially going to happen. So it's okay, I think. So for exploration, I'm gonna give it a 3 here. Now finally we go on to P, so polish. As presented, it is really nice and legible and easy to read. The one thing I would have liked to see is, there are 2 things I would love to see that would increase the score here. One is battle maps. It would have been really nice to see some nice, high quality, or even just something there, so for the virtual tabletop crowd that need them, or at least require them for certain instances, it would have been nice to have those. In addition to that, it would have been nice to have the handout that I mentioned earlier, the Magnum Opus itself. Those are things that really push this up to the next level. Now, because it doesn't have maps and doesn't have the handouts, but it is still really well structured and put together. The art that is used very effectively. It's used in a way that means you don't get word bombed through the whole thing. The whole adventure is only 18 pages. The cover is really unique and interesting. All of Luke's covers are. They have this very different way of looking that gives them a unique feel, and I really like that. Now, total overall, though, I have to be honest, this is the one area what I would have seen more art placed and peppered throughout. There are some things, some areas where it is a word bomb, and there is just tons and tons of words all across the entire page. And it would have been nice to pepper a few more examples of what the areas look like, to help DMs kind of look at it and go, oh, I understand what that is. I can kind of describe what I'm looking at now. Use more. The more information you provide to a DM, the better he can just fill in the gaps. The less work he has to do, or she has to do, the better, because it means that they can focus on the things that they want to focus on that are unique to their player table, things that they know their players will be interested in and want to do as part of this, because most of these get shoved into existing campaigns. They find a unique idea, so it's nice to include those little bits and pieces. The descriptions that are presented for the various areas are really well written. I really like them. They're very show, don't tell, and I really like the way they're structured. But overall, for polish, it's going to be a 3 for me for here as well. Okay, so overall, combat 3, roleplay 5, exploration 3, polish 3. So 3, 3, 5, 3. I think with this one, it's a really interesting thing. You've got an adventure that really heavily weighs on that roleplay column. But overall, I'm going to rate it. So that gives you a 9, 14. 14.4 is 3.5. Well, 3.333 or whatever. No, 3.5. Yeah, so 3.5. So I'll be rating it a 4 on the DM's Guild, because I always go that way rather than that way. I don't do the DM. I'm thinking against the D&D logic, which is always round down. I always round up, because I don't think it deserves a 3. I think it, for the the adventure it's presented in terms of, if you want a roleplay heavy, very much, I want to be able to avoid all combat altogether, I think this would be that side of things. But you have to go into it knowing that. You have to have a group that wants that. And I think as long as that's true, I rate it a 4. Thank you. Please do remember to like, comment, and subscribe. This is DM Dungo. Peace out.